I'll just go through a little bit of the, I suppose, the background, some of the rationale, and then some of the learnings that we've had in working with the electric vehicles. So I guess first one is going to the rationale of why we're investing. There's a lot of others, I think, holding back at this point. A lot of people thinking it's probably too early in the cycle of the investing. So I wanted to talk a little bit initially just about why we're looking to do it. So fundamentally, our view is that the electric vehicles are going to come, and probably come sooner than what most people think. So for us, a lot of the investment is really about the learning side of it. So trying to understand what it means for operations. And as I've got at the bottom there's a number of factors that when you get into operations, you need to be thinking about in terms of the charging, on-site safety, driver engagement, different driver behaviours, the acceptance at stores and any other complications there. And then the overall timing coordination, which links a little bit to the charging, but it's just getting the right operating rhythm and cycle. The other piece though is if you start to get across the, I suppose, the supply and demand, you're also in a much better position to be able to influence the discussion on the regulatory impacts. At the moment, probably a little bit around the incentive piece, and then looking to generally be proactive in the space. So largely for us, as I said, it's a lot about trying to learn and understand what the impacts are going to be when we get to the point where the economics become compelling. So second point then, just moving on, just trying to minimize the screens, goes a little bit more to the business. So beyond just the learning, what is the business benefit we're looking to achieve? Now, and there's a few things here, but a lot of it, and we can talk a little bit about the economics of the electric vehicles anyway, but one of the big benefits that we see is around the quieter and less disruptive nature of electric vehicles. Particularly for us, where we've got quite heavy restrictions, in particular in the more built up and urban areas around Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, the opportunity to start looking at off-peak deliveries, taking deliveries outside of those times and trying to work collaboratively with councils to understand how we improve that. We think the electric vehicles have a role to play there. Second one is as we get more of and you're probably seeing them rolling out around the country, the smaller metro stores. A lot of these are in those particularly built-up areas, trying to drive greater convenience for customers. But again, given the nature and the type of access, the type of location, we think electric vehicles can have a role to play there. They're often in fairly dense areas around the CBD, so the distances and the travel are not really a consideration. I guess the third area, kind of keeping on largely on the noise theme, is around the home deliveries. So being able to provide a quieter, more convenient service, but again, early mornings and later at night, we think that probably opens up some opportunities there. Now, moving on, as Daniel said, we started this journey back in about 2017, when I was really challenged internally to say, let's go and get an electric vehicle and let's start the journey. So that's when we started the serious investigation, and we did a lot of research at the time, trying to engage all the OEMs, the various manufacturers, and I think at the time we're probably too early. So there's some progress and some I suppose releases coming out from sort of the likes of Daimler and Volvo and Scania now, but back then there was not a lot happening, and we found as it was then, a smaller company, now a bigger company in SEA Electric, and started having some discussions there about what was possible, which then obviously led to the truck that you see through this pack. So I suppose moving on that journey and talking about that broader engagement piece, there was also the element around that regulatory and the industry influence. And one of the groups that Woolies is a member of is the Australian Logistics Council. Within that group, there was the establishment of an electric vehicle working group specifically to try and further the regulatory push and act as a bit of a peak body back to government, particularly around the electric commercial vehicles. And so that's a fairly active group that, since it was established, has been meeting sort of every 6 weeks to every 2 months, and I think building a bit of momentum. later in 2018, then we had the first electric vehicle get on the road, what we affectionately called Eve, first of her kind. That was around about September, and that vehicle's basically been running in and around supermarkets ever since. The last element on there was obviously providing some input and support for the Senate inquiry, trying to drive and sort of escalate the need for more incentives, particularly in the commercial vehicle space. Not that really did a lot of good in terms of the output from that Senate inquiry. Moving forward into 2019, so we're working with SEA Electric, and Mark and I are talking regularly on the delivery of the second vehicle, and we can probably talk a little bit more about that. But again, that's one that we'll be taking delivery of probably later in July this year. And it will largely be a replica of the first one. The other thing that we did in the photo that you see there is a bit of support for the New South Wales government policy launch around the electric and hybrid vehicles. So that was done earlier this year, just ahead of the New South Wales election, trying to drive a bit more direction from them. Again, not a lot in there in terms of the freight policy. Sorry, door closing beside me. So I think it's important that we get it out there and we start to drive particularly the awareness and the understanding of the challenges, but also the need for some government support. The last point I put there, which really reflects more back to our early part of the journey, is the other manufacturers in terms of when they're likely to have something available. I think what we've been told is sort of 2021-ish in Europe, and then probably about 12 months after that for Australia. So there's some different figures moving around, but it is coming, but it's taking a while to get there. So moving on to the one that we've been spending most of the time on. So it's a converted Hino vehicle with a 14 pallet body on it. Body's got I suppose all up, we're looking at a payload around about 11 tonnes, which in the grocery space, 11 tonnes over 14, so we're talking about 650, 700 kilos per pallet, is generally very fit for purpose. So, and where we've been running this a lot is in Victoria, delivering produce, and most of our produce pallets are about a half a tonne. So you're looking more like the 7 tonne payload. So for what we need to do, the payload, which is obviously often one of the constraints, is not too much of an issue. We went with a fully freezer rated body on it, but also put the electric fridge, and the fridge runs completely off the onboard battery. That was probably one of the harder pieces to get right, and just working with our partners to get the right voltage and the right configuration on that piece. Also got the electric tailgate and the electric door. All tailgates are electric, but that was on there, and then the electric door. So we did try and push the boundaries in terms of what's possible when we did that one. On it, we've got a 212 kilowatt battery. We get about 180 to 200 kilometres range. Range, I think becomes quite subjective to your payload, but also your terrain, how much braking you've got, and what speed you're driving at. So if you, ironically, in the more urban areas where you're doing lower speed and you've got more braking, you do get a better performance on the range. So moving ahead to some of the learnings, and I guess as I started saying, a lot of this journey was about learning. So some of the things we've taken out around the operational considerations. So number of operating design changes that we've put into it. One of the examples on that is around the fridge. So when we first wired it up, and this was also the first refrigerated vehicle that SEA Electric had done, it was wired in such a way that when we get to a store, turn off the key, it actually cuts the refrigeration. So there was some, which is a perfectly logical thing to do, but normally with the diesels, you would keep that running and keep the fridge on to maintain your cold chain, even though you're not running your vehicle. So which was an easy fix and a rewiring, but there's some little operational learnings like that. The other ones, sort of moving on, the payload refinements, and particularly we'll talk a little about the use of these in online, but where we're not too payload constrained in the heavy vehicle, some of the things we've looked at for the online vehicles, payload becomes more of a consideration. So working through the sensitivities on that. Likewise, battery position and weight in terms of where you actually put those on the vehicle to optimise your axle weights. The concept of the speed versus torque. So on this first vehicle, there is no gearbox on that. So you're quite dependent on what your gearing and differential ratio is, and how you want to balance that maximum top speed versus the torque throughout, which goes a lot into your range and your battery. And then safety processes. One of the other ones that we picked up was the need to go and reinforce the safety processes for plugging in fairly high voltage 3-phase power within the distribution centres and make sure that can all be done safely. And then looking at the store impacts, happy to say not too much in the way of store impacts. Round some of the experience of getting a customised vehicle and effectively the whole procurement part, what I'd say is it's far from what I'd call easy. The industry itself is not especially mature, and a lot of this is still custom work. So I think there's a lot of people out there that would view it as, you know, moving into an electric vehicle, you go down to the shop, order what you want and buy one. We're probably not at that point. I think the level of customization to try and get it right means that there is more time and effort to be put in up front. However, that said, development is moving pretty quickly, and that's on both the supply side and the demand side. So I think more and more customers are becoming aware of what's possible and what they want. And at the same time, there's quite a bit happening on the supply side in terms of manufacture, but also the progression of the technology, and in particular around the battery and battery density technology. The last one on there is clearly one of the, I'll call it more of an issue than a challenge. I think it's the right thing to be getting on with, but there is a lack of incentives, which for me is more of a concern. Not that we need the incentive to be investing, but I think where the incentives are an issue is that we're not actually seeing all the suppliers wanting to invest in this market because of that lack of support. And then the last one, just in terms of learnings and reflections, you know, I think it's about finding the right tool for the right task. So if you look at what we've got here in that vehicle, 180, 200 kilometres, what we've been able to do is get a good rhythm of 2 different deliveries per day. So effectively coming back to the distribution centre and getting out twice, and then still having the time to give it the, I'm sure I'll get the question, but full charge is about 10 hours. But generally after we've been doing the operations, you're looking at about a 6 to 7 hour charge time. So again, if you can accommodate that with what you've got to do, and that doesn't become a major impediment, then I think the right, you know, the electric vehicle on the right task can be quite effective. And then lastly, before I hand over to Mark, in terms of some of the where to from here. So I think what I'd say is we are looking to invest and grow the fleet. Obviously the second vehicle coming along becomes part of that. But you know, probably within our business, we won't see the mass adoption until we get to a point where the technology really supports the use in prime movers. And that's purely because we don't have a huge, heavy, rigid fleet. That said, on the positive side, the opportunity for more rapid growth in the home delivery fleet, we do see as a potential. The technology, just in terms of payload, range and maturity, does seem to be coming quite a bit faster in the light commercial vehicle. We're not quite there yet, but we think there's a potential. But what I would say is that I think there's still quite a bit more to do, generally across industry, but specifically for us as well, to understand the impact of the charging infrastructure. And that's both operationally, but also then just very practically. Because I don't think more public charging infrastructure is going to help commercial vehicles, because the economics don't really support it to have have drivers out there with vehicles being charged while they're operating. But then to get all of that charging infrastructure on site becomes quite a drain on I suppose the grid and the actual supply of power to the site. But trying to get that right, get the right mix of fast charging, time of day, capacity, number of units, I think that becomes probably even harder and more challenging than getting the vehicles. But with that, I'll stop talking for a bit, and I'll hand over to Mark.
How are we looking there? We're sharing?
Yeah, that's great, Mark.
You can see the presentation?
Yes.
Good, terrific. Thanks very much for that, Ben. And thanks to Daniel and Alex for the opportunity here today to talk a little bit about our situation. Look, my name's Mark Cameron, I'm the Regional Director here for SEA Electric. For the last 17 years, I've been working with one of the large European OEMs. So my life for the better part of the last 20 years has been diesel. Now I'm making the move across to the electrification of commercial vehicles. And I'm asked quite a lot to present in this space and to talk about what we're doing at SEA Electric. And almost without exception, the first question I'm asked is how much? And the second question I'm asked is, what about the infrastructure? And my counter to that is, I think we're asking the wrong questions. When we're talking about commercial electric vehicles today, the right question to ask really is, why are we doing this? And in answering that, I talk about the volume of vehicles we've got on the road in Australia today. We've currently got about 600,000 heavy vehicles, diesel, predominantly diesel running in Australia. 100,000 of those are articulated vehicles, and they're not suitable for electrification at this stage, but 500,000 of them are rigids. If I segment that 500,000 down, and so I only really want to look at the 3.5, 4 tonne through to the 20 tonne category, the metro delivery type vehicles, I've got 250,000 vehicles. Now, 250,000 vehicles, if I make an assumption and say that they're travelling about 100 kilometres per day when they're operating, my question is, how much CO2 or how much carbon is that 250,000 vehicles releasing in a day? And the answer, surprisingly to many, is on a daily basis in the Australian market, 8,650 tonnes is being released. So why are we talking about electrification of commercial vehicles? In the 4 tonne to 20 tonne category, over 8,600 tonnes of CO2 being emitted per day. By starting to electrify that segment, we can start to have an impact on that. So having said that as a starting point, the question then becomes, okay, why haven't we done this to date? Why haven't we electrified in the commercial segment? And the answer, there's 3 key factors that come into play here. It's firstly the price, secondly the weight, be it the weight of batteries or payload, and then the third point is the range. How far can we get out of these vehicles? And what we found is at this point in time, the business model has developed to the stage whereby in metro deliveries, the price of batteries has fallen to the right level, the weight of batteries has fallen to the right level, and the range is acceptable as per Ben's presentation. So when I start to talk about battery prices decreasing, when our business model was developed, it was thought that in order for it to be successful, we needed to have batteries fall to about $300 per kilowatt hour. And the forecasts were that would occur in 2022. The reality was it was reached in mid-2016. And then SEA Electric had its first vehicle on the road in mid-2017. So battery prices have been screaming down, but at the same time, battery density, as Ben alluded to, has also been increasing, so you get more bang for your buck out of the batteries. Now, with those 3 key factors, weight, range, and price coming together, they come together under this particular model. We're talking about metropolitan distribution and deliveries, or back-to-base deliveries, where vehicles are travelling 150 to 200, somewhere in that range, kilometres per day, starting full, returning empty, or alternatively starting empty, returning full, back to base with a latency period where the vehicle can be charged. So that's the model. Now, a little bit about SEA Electric. We are an automotive technology company. We've developed a proprietary product called the C-Drive system, and that's suitable for adaptation into most OEM cab chassis models, Japanese or European, and we're working with all of those. And the C-Drive technology is, firstly, it's modular and flexible, and that makes it ideally suitable as an electrification program with really low cost and short lead time to market. So if we want to impact that 8,650 tonnes per day into the atmosphere, here's the perfect solution. Now, a little bit more about Sea Electric. We are a Melbourne-based company, but with offices in LA, in Europe, in Southeast Asia, here in Melbourne, of course, where our head office is, where I'm sitting at the moment, but also in Auckland. And just briefly touching on one of Ben's points, which was about incentives. Strong incentives in New Zealand at the moment via a contestable ECA fund, where it's about low emission vehicles on the road. Asia's strongly interested. Europe, there's lots of incentives, and certainly over in the US on the West Coast, plenty of incentives in place for electrification of vehicles. Here is our head office in Dandenong in Melbourne, where I'm sitting, as I said, our prototyping or first of its kind assembly plant and the office complex around it. And there's one of the Woolworths vehicles, of course, being assembled, or the first. There's Eve. Now, the C-Drive system, as I said, modular and flexible. It fits into most EVs or most cab chassis models. And this is where there's a difference between the typical passenger car and a commercial vehicle. With a passenger car, with the different models changing as regularly as they are, the battery designs need to change, and that can be quite expensive. When we start to talk about commercial vehicles, generally you've got the cab at the front, followed by two parallel chassis rails which run down the rear, which hold the axles and supported together by cross members. What we've done with our modular system is we've been able to have the engine removed from the cab chassis, from the cab component. Where the engine's removed, we put our front battery pod, and where the gearbox traditionally sat, we've been able to put our secondary battery pod. And they both sit within the chassis rails, so they're well protected, and there's no safety issues from that perspective. The battery pods then feed the battery motor, which then is direct coupled into the rear diff. Fairly simple, and I won't say basic, but fairly simple. It's a modular system with all the smarts sitting in the controller network to control, to pull all these items together. We've developed 5 different cab chassis models, ranging from the 3.5 to 4.5 tonne, with the less than 200 kilometre range. But as we move up with different battery packs and different power outputs, in the 4 to 6 tonne, we have a design there called a C-Drive 100, C-Drive 120, up to 14 tonne, the 140 to 18 tonne, and the C-Drive 180 up to 23.5 tonne. An interesting point here, when this was put together, when the designs and the naming and nomenclature was developed, which was only well, less than 2 years ago now, the 60, 100, 120, 140 and 180 were developed based on the kilowatt output rating of the battery packs. And I said that battery densities are increasing very quickly. In fact, the 120 was 120 kilowatt hours. Battery density's changed. We've been able to lift up to 132 kilowatt hours. And on the 180, we've moved from 180 kilowatt hours to 216. So the change is occurring very quickly. There's 5 cab chassis models, 2 van models, the C-Drive 50 and the C-Drive 70, 4 to 8 cubic metres and 6 to 10 cubic metres. Also commuter bus application in the longer wheelbase, capable of 15 passengers with driver, and 88 kilowatt hour battery with a range of 300 kilometres. So that's the range. Now, again, as Ben pointed out, the important part when you're removing a diesel engine or taking a diesel chassis, which has controlled air conditioning, component cooling, heating, power steering and air compressors and the like. Now we need to do all that via electrification, and that's what we've done here on board. And it all sits together, all comes together, and the magic is really all about the integration of these components. Now, I said at the outset there was 2 important questions: how much and what about infrastructure? One of the things that we've done from a CV perspective, commercial vehicle perspective, is we've built in an onboard charger, a 22 kilowatt onboard charger. So we have access to a massive charging network, in that all it simply needs is a 32 amp type 2 15 volt outlet, which most commercial and industrial businesses have on site. So it's simply a matter of plug and play. Again, another shot of of a typical installation. And then the next point I want to make is that the reality is this is here and now. If we want to make an impact and we want to start to create or take the first step along the journey towards a sustainable transport future, we can do that now. Here at SEA Electric, we've got the solutions. We've put together quite a few compactors on the Iveco ACO chassis, worked on the Isuzu cab chassis, also the Hino cab chassis. Here you can see some pictures of the C-Drive 70, the van model. Then the C-Drive 100 on an Isuzu chassis. Again, there's Woolworths again. Up to the 14-ton, two different versions in the 120. You can see the models, and these are all operational models today. This is the future. This is here and now. The C-Drive 180, of course, Woolworths, and also there's Mercedes-Benz Iconic doing garbage work. And just before I finish up, yeah, Mercedes-Benz also, there's a Dennis Eagle compactor being put in place. And interestingly, there's been a huge interest in the United States from Ford for electrification of some of their models. So one of the other interesting things is the Victorian government have got behind SEA Electric and provided some significant support for us to put in place an assembly plant in the Latrobe Valley, southeast of Melbourne, where we will produce 100% or assemble 100% electric commercial vehicles. That will be up and running by the end of 2021, with creating over 250 jobs progressively from 2021 going forward. So the message I leave you with is, from a commercial vehicles perspective, the electrification is here and now. So if we want to be part of the reduction of CO2 emissions and be part of the shift towards a sustainable transport future, please, we're here and ready to speak about it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark. And thank you also, Ben, for those really interesting presentations. And congratulations to Woolworths for moving so early and taking that bold step where others haven't. And obviously, hopefully motivating others to go there. And obviously, SEA Electric is a great Australian success story in this industry, and congratulations for all the great work you're doing. I'll hand over now to Alex, who's going to ask questions. If you do have questions, yeah, just keep putting them into the window there. And yeah, Alex, if you want to just jump in.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Mark. So our first question is for Ben, and I might just skip to the end of it and then give Dan a few minutes to talk on the electricity network part. But Ben, how is Woolworths tackling the cost-effective ways of charging, and not just when energy is available? So are you looking at peak and off-peak energy supply? Are you having to factor that into your electricity bills and things like that? How is that affecting your planning?
Yeah, I mean, with really one vehicle, that's probably not too much of a concern at this point. When we've done the numbers on the economics, we as a large user of electricity do buy reasonably well. So I think it still stacks up. I think the other, if that was the first question about how do we handle the impact on the grid?
Yeah.
My view on that one is, so at the moment we're not going fast enough that we're going to stress the grid. But I think the supply side for the electricity needs to come along with that demand, because clearly none of this makes sense if the grid can't keep up with it, or if we're just going to burn more coal to enable what is a sort of a notionally green outcome in transport. That doesn't make sense. I think there's naturally got to be a level of evolution on the energy supply side, and if that's not, then I think it's absolutely going to hold back the conversion.
Okay, great. And then, Mark, just a question for you about your garbage trucks. Where are they up to, and what's the status of the technology at the moment? I mean, councils have a lot of questions about this area. I think we've got quite a few on the line.
Yeah, and look, we're really happy to talk to the individual councils, and we are doing that with a lot of them at the moment. We've got vehicles, Mercedes-Benz, we've got ACO, we've also got the Dennis Eagle, and a Hino wheelbase operating. We've got them operating at the moment with Cleanaway and WM Waste Management, and I think there's others as well there. But the reality is both side lifters and rear lifters are all operational today and working well.
Good. Okay, great. And then have there been any weight distribution benefits for the vehicles from electric conversion?
Look, we haven't seen, I can see the question there, we haven't seen a centre of gravity issue really, but the battery packs are heavy, and they are, at the moment, they're still slightly heavier than the engine gearbox and exhaust system that is removed from the chassis. So what we have to do is you have to be a little bit careful about the positioning of the battery pod so we're not causing axle weight issues, particularly front axle weight issues.
Okay, great. And Ben, actually, this is a question from me. What has been the drivers' attitudes towards the electric truck that you've now got?
Generally pretty good. So we've had a few different drivers in it and tried to maintain some consistency on who was driving it, so they get a level of comfort, but also we get some consistent feedback. And we've gone through a couple of our major providers in Linfox and Toll. Both have been very supportive. You know, I think the performance is good in terms of the low range takeoff. Everybody basically is you know, really happy with how it drives, but I think find it really easy because of that sort of low end torque and the takeoff. It feels like quite an agile vehicle. But no negative feedback at this point.
Can I just add a little bit to that? One of the interesting things we found in our feedback from drivers, we need to really work with the drivers in the initial stages, particularly because of the regenerative braking function, because they're not used to it. It is something new that people need to adapt to. So we enjoy that training part of the exercise.
Great. And the trucks themselves, and this is to SEA Electric, do you support DC charging?
It's high voltage DC fast charging, I think is the question. There's a couple of them there, isn't there? Look, at the moment, it's not fitted on the vehicles that we've distributed. We're working on that at the moment, and we expect to see that come to market January next year, or early in the new year, let's say.
Okay, and this is another one here from Toby. What items need to be de-risked for customers, given your experience?
Sorry, the question's for me?
Yep.
So just run through it again.
What items need to be de-risked for customers, given your experience?
Well, look, I'm not sure that there's a lot. Look, from a risk perspective, there's obviously range anxiety and people concerned about that. But we can work through those issues with the customers. That's not really of a concern. I don't see there's a big issue here at all. Once we understand the application, we understand their range, their desired, what they're trying to achieve, then we can find a solution for that. As long as they're not trying to drive Melbourne, Sydney at 100 kilometres an hour, then we've got a solution.
I think just adding on that one, we are at a point, given it is so new, that support still remains somewhat of a risk. So I think you've got to probably consciously look at where you would want to deploy the vehicle and make sure that you've got some relevant support for that. Not that we've had any issues, but you know, I think the experience is still fairly limited in terms of those that could provide the support.
And Ben, this is for you. What level of incentive would assist the business case for your EV truck procurement?
The business case, the way we've done it, I think, is still reasonably strong. My concern, because I don't think we're talking about big incentives, but the other reality is, even if the government were to chip in, you know, quite large incentives, I don't think that the supply would be able to keep up. If you look at New Zealand, I think they collectively, and Mark, you might be closer to the figures, but I think it's over about the last 3 years, and they've had sort of 5 or 6 rounds of the contestable fund. But I think have handed out around 15 to 20 million. Yeah. They're not huge, but what it does is it sends a signal to the suppliers that the government is absolutely on board. They're going to do what they can to support it, and that they really want it to be adopted. So we're actually seeing that the take up and the investment from suppliers into New Zealand is probably more than in Australia. So for me, it's less about what does it actually do for our business and what does it do on an individual basis. It's more collectively, you know, will manufacturers see this as an attractive market to come and invest in?
Great. And then Mark, we've got 2 questions here on garbage trucks. So what's the price difference between a normal garbage truck and an electric garbage truck, include life cycle costs, and what's the range of the compactor?
Yeah, the range, depending on regenerative braking, depending on the route. And what we like to do here is we like to sit down with the customer in each individual situation, map their route, understand where they're wanting to take the vehicle, so we can get a really good understanding of the situation and we can accurately predict the range. But 150, 200, 250 kilometres is sort of what we're talking about there. And the second,
great. And then, in terms of life cycle costs, purchase costs.
Yeah, look, the purchase cost, again, it depends on the configuration of the vehicle, and this was specifically garbage truck related, but certainly the compactor and ancillary equipment, which is consistent with the current design, that's a very expensive component compared to the price of the cab chassis and even an electrified cab chassis. But what we're seeing with customers, and it depends on the particular application, we're seeing a payback on the incremental cost of between 2, 2.5, 3, and 4, just over 4 years. Now, while that might seem an extensive period, the reality is during that time you've significantly decreased your servicing costs and any brake-related costs because of regenerative braking. All the operational costs, typical servicing operational costs, significantly decrease right from day one. That's what gives you your payback period. The cost of electricity versus the cost of diesel significantly works in the favour of the customer.
Okay, great. And then we've got one question, quite a technical one, about heavy duty truck charging in the USA. It's been suggested that it will settle somewhere around 1 to 2 megawatt connectors, charging sites going up to 20. Do you think there's appetite in Australia for this?
Look, at the moment, it's early days within the Australian market. We've got what we have available. I think the future solution will unfold with time, of course. But look, I can't really predict which way it'll go from that perspective.
Okay, I've got a question for Ben. Ben, I'm sometimes asked by customers when I'm working with them, how did you validate, when you went through the procurement process, you're obviously given figures by the manufacturers, which in an early stage market like electric vehicles are very hard to validate. How did you sort of get comfort with the numbers that you were being given in terms of performance and range, all the different things that you needed to put into your business case? How did you get comfort around those numbers?
You're right. I think we're at a point where you probably don't really get the comfort in the traditional sense. So you probably need to look at this a little bit more. And look, we're almost past this, but I'd sort of say some of this is almost like R&D spend. Putting down the small bets now on 1 or 2 vehicles to understand what that looks like. So rather than try and validate theoretically, I think you're better off just getting the vehicle, because there's a lot more to it around the operational implications and just those costs. But I think broadly, and I don't mind sharing, I think we looked on that big one. You're probably in the range of $80,000 to $100,000 incremental capital on what you would have otherwise spent. And then likewise, as Mark was saying, really your payback comes from your electricity versus fuel for common distance and operations, including your fridge motor. And then likewise your reduced servicing costs. And I think our numbers were similar to what Mark had looked at. If we could achieve all of those parameters, which is what we then had to go and prove, payback was probably around 3 years or a little bit less. I think it is a slightly different discussion you've got to have just at this point.
Okay, great. And then we've got a question here, and this might go to both of you. You might be able to answer this. How do the electric vehicle warranties compare to diesel? So is there a separate battery warranty, or is it included in the vehicle purchase price?
With our product, the vehicle's warranted the same as the original OEM warranty, be that 3 years, 100,000 kilometres, whatever the original chassis provider's warranty is. From a battery perspective, we have a 5-year guarantee on the battery and a 10-year expected life.
Yeah, I think they're not quite warranted, but expected to do about 3,500 charge cycles.
Absolutely.
if you think about how many, even if you use it 7 days a week, that still gets you pretty close to 10 years. We'll find out in a few years whether they live up to that.
So Ben, in terms of the way that this sort of played out for you, have you got is there a sort of step-by-step process you could walk us through in terms of, going through the process of selecting SEA and going through the process of, I guess, evaluating and going into pilots, and then what was sort of the life cycle that you went through to get to this point?
Yeah, look, I think the challenge is, even if we had a nice clear set of requirements we could take out, it'd be a very limited field that could even provide an offering. I think with SEA, and I think Mark would agree, I think fairly aspirational company in terms of good vision and willing to take on the challenge, and push the boundaries on what's possible. Whereas a lot of the others, coming from a more traditional manufacturing base, like your major OEMs, they're obviously a lot more conservative. They're very very conscious of the brand reputation. So they're in a different space. Whereas, I think with SEA Electric, we found someone that we could partner with, throw the challenges to, and then jointly work through, some of those engineering pieces. As I said, things like the rewiring of the fridges, some of the charging implications. There's a few things, and then working through things like regenerative brake settings, how we do engine braking, and a number of things. So there's still quite a few things that we're working on jointly. So I hope I sort of answered your question, Daniel.
No, definitely.
It's a difficult one in that you've literally got a fairly small field to choose from. And I think you're better off looking for a partner that can support you on the journey, as opposed to someone that can sell you a truck. So
it's collaborative procurement. So, and there's a lot of people here on the phone. Well, I'll just ask one more question, but if people do want to ask a question, you can unmute in a second and ask. Just in terms of the charges, was that a collaborative process with SEA, or how did you go about the charging infrastructure?
You mean the actual vehicle charging, or?
Yeah, the vehicle charging. So the actual installation of the chargers, I should say.
Yeah, I mean, as Mark said, literally we're plugging into plugging into three-phase power, which we have on most of our distribution centres anyway for plugging fridge motors into. But likewise, if we're pre-cooling our trailers and we've got them on docks, we don't want to be burning diesel. So for a lot of our sites, we've actually got those plugs quite readily available, and they're not expensive to put a few more in if you need them.
Okay, if anyone on the phone wants to unmute and ask a question now.
Just Daniel, before you do, there's a question there from City Power. Will the C plant Latrobe just be assembly? Has anything happening with local battery manufacturing? Look, not at this stage. We're certainly not in battery manufacturing here. We're sourcing batteries and installing them. I think what will happen in the future with respect to the complete supply chain within EVs, well, there's a massive transformation going to happen globally. In fact, it's already started. Arguably, you could say Australia's probably behind the game a little bit here. But from our perspective, the Latrobe Valley is about assembly, yes.
Great. Okay, I'll give it just a few minutes for anyone who wants to put up their hand on the phone to ask a question.
We've got a question from the EVC here. Well, how did you go about insurance or OH&S policy or internal policies? How much did you have to change to introduce electric trucks?
Not too much really. I think under our insurance policy, my understanding is that it wasn't particularly looked at any different to a normal vehicle. I don't. And look, on that policy, it's probably fairly low risk, but so that wasn't an issue. The only other one where we've probably had to review it a little bit was just around some of the safe working procedures when it comes to plugging the vehicle in, handling the cables, some of those lockout procedures. Beyond that, there was really nothing too different. that had to be done for the sites or the operations.